Hello, folks. Welcome to this tutorial video. In this video, we're going to go ahead and cover some of the basic functions for Excel. And this is going to include creating a table, adjusting a table, creating borders, as well as creating our scatter plot graphs and showing our trend lines and all of these other stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. To open a new workbook, we're going to go ahead and click on this top left column where it says blank workbook. Now, when we open up a new workbook, here on the bottom left corner, we have sheet one. Right next to that icon, there's a plus sign. So if we wanted to add a new sheet, we can go ahead and click on this button right here, and it'll pop up and it'll say sheet two, sheet three, and so forth and so forth. And so what we can do is we can always rename the sheet. So I'm just going to go ahead and rename this as data set one. Okay. You guys can go ahead and rename your sheets that would best describe your data set and what you're doing. So that's just a function that I wanted to show early on. Now, the next thing that you guys might have noticed is that there's a whole bunch of columns and a whole bunch of rows. And each column and each row is pretty small. And so what we want to do is we want to expand these cells. So each and every single one of these rectangles that you guys observe, they're known as a cell. So to expand the cell, we're going to click on the top left corner right underneath where you see E8, for instance. So it's the junction between the A and the junction between the A and the number one. So this gray triangle, I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and it highlights all of the cells inside this sheet. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hover my cursor over the borderline between two columns. So right now it's hovering over B and C. You guys can hover it over any lines that separates two columns. And all you have to do is just click and drag to the left to expand. And it's going to auto adjust all of the columns. I can go ahead and click and move it to the left if I wanted to shorten those columns. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for the rows. So I'm going to hover my cursor between any two numbers. I'm going to click and I'm going to drag down to expand the cell going down. So that way I have a larger cell overall. Okay. So the next thing I want to do is I want to click on that same triangle option. And I'm just going to go ahead and start formatting my cells such that all of my text and my data is centered. So I'm going to center my text. And the font size is not going to be this very, very small, measly number. I'm going to go ahead and increase my font size to something about, 24, 22, 20. It just really depends on the size of your specific cell. So I'll just go ahead and put in 22. And I'm going to go ahead and just, test it out. So right now, it looks really nice. It's large. It's large enough to read. It's large enough to see. It's not super teeny tiny. And so while your cells are highlighted, again, if you want everything to be bold, italicized, underlined, you can go ahead and do so. I'm not going to click on any of these options just yet. The next thing I want to show you guys is the wrap text feature. And so if I were to just type in just random letters inside a cell, and if I click enter, notice that these letters are now overlapping column A and column C, and it's not staying inside column B. And so to fix this issue, we're going to go ahead and click on the cell and click Wrap Text. When you guys click on wrapping the text, then it just ensures that all of your text stays inside the cell and it doesn't overlap with any adjacent columns. And so what I want to do is I just want to delete this. And so for me to not have to worry about, setting up wrap text and all that stuff, again, I'm going to click on all of the cells and I'm just going to click on wrap text. So notice how this function is highlighted for all of these columns. So now if I were to, type in just random stuff, notice that it's automatically wrapping that text inside that cell and it's not hovering between two adjacent columns. Okay. So far we've kind of just set up our basic layout. We've expanded the cells, we've kept everything centered, we've increased the font size, and then rewrap the text. Now let's go ahead and get into the nitty-gritty details of creating a table and creating a scatter plot graph that has all the fixings that's required for your chemistry lab course. To start, I want to go ahead and talk about the two concepts that you guys need to review if you haven't reviewed it for quite some time. But basically, it's the x-axis and the y-axis on Excel. Whenever you guys are creating a table on Excel and later converting that into a graph, your first column is always going to be the x-axis. Now, you can see many columns here on the screen. And so a lot of students like to start on column A because it just makes sense for them because it's the first column. However, the first column is an arbitrary column. The first column that you put in all your numbers, whether it be A, B, or C, is always going to represent the x-axis, the horizontal line on your graph. And so I'm gonna go ahead and arbitrarily state that my x-axis is going to be my column D. Again, you guys can start at column A or you guys can start at column B. But to just showcase and highlight my point, I'm just going to start on column D. So just to remind myself that this is the x-axis, I'm just going to go ahead and type in x-axis. Now, the x-axis in your graph and your data table will represent your independent variable. So let me go ahead and type this in real quick. So your independent variable is the variable that doesn't depend on another variable. I mean, it's independent. And so an example of an independent variable is time. And for now, let's go ahead and put time in years. Again, time can be minutes, seconds, milliseconds, nanoseconds, and the list goes on. And so for now, I'm going to go ahead and put years associated to my time. Now, if you guys choose column D as your arbitrary x-axis, then the column to the right of it, and it's always to the immediate right, will be your y-axis. Now, if you guys are taking Chem 115, you guys will learn more functions on Excel. And the x and y axis, the columns will be a little bit more, there's going to be a lot more columns to choose from if you guys decide to take Chem 115, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Okay. Anyways, so I'm going to go ahead and click on, or I'm just going to go ahead and just arbitrary label column E as my y-axis because it's to the right of column D. Okay, so we have our x and we have our y. Again, the x and y can actually be A and B, or it can be B and C, or it can be C and D. The main point is that the first column that you start typing numbers down, that's always going to be your x-axis on your graph. And so let's make up a dependent variable. So let's go ahead and talk about the height of a human. Okay. So let's put in height of a human. And again, when you guys are describing your values, a value means absolutely nothing without a unit. So right now, let's just go ahead and do this in feet. We're kind of familiar with that unit. And so what these two variables is trying to describe to the reader is how the height of a human changes over a period of time. And so time is an independent variable. It is continuous. And depending on how much time passed, the height of a human is going to change. So that's why it's the dependent variable. Okay. So to make this graph, we first need data table. So I'm just going to kind of scoot over here just so it's centered. And we'll work with easy points for now. Let's just go ahead and put in, I don't know, 0.5 years. Let's go ahead and put in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Let's go from there. And then for the height of the human, let's just go ahead and put in some random numbers here. So 5 point, well, actually that might be too large to start off with. So let's just do 2 point blah, 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 3 point blah, 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 and then 4 point blah, blah, blah. And last but not least, 5 point blah, blah, blah. And so, so this is currently my raw data, and I haven't taken into consideration significant figures just yet, but I'll do that in just a second. Okay. Let me go ahead and scoot this over. And so the next thing that I want to do is I want to create a box around each cell. And the reason why you want to do that is because you want your data table to look presentable, especially when you're transferring it into a Word document file. So for example, again, the X and the Y axis, they're just reminders of what this column represents and what this column represents. You actually don't really need to type that down. These are just physical reminders. And so if I wanted to create a data table from this specific section, right underneath the font, there's this little scroll down button, and it's called borders. And so we can go ahead and draw borders around our cells, our data cells. And so let's go ahead and just draw a border grid. Okay. Now, if I were to draw a border grid, oops, I can go ahead and just click and drag. And then when I click and drag, it creates the border grid, just like this. Okay, so it's pretty simple. Now, you want to make sure that this is clicked out when you're done drawing your border grid. Okay. So next, I want to go ahead and fix my significant figures. And to fix your significant figures, there's several ways to do this. There's shortcuts, and then there's there's other options. And so I want you guys to notice that on the y-axis, the height of the human, I have varying significant figures. And so I want to make sure that all of these sig figs are the same. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and highlight. So let's just report arbitrarily 3 sig figs. So what I want to do is I want to highlight one cell, And then right here on the, right around the center of your Excel under the Home tab, underneath General, you'll see this where it says decrease decimal and then increase decimal. So I can go ahead and decrease my decimal to report 2 decimal places, but since there's a number in front of that, I get a total of 3 sig figs. And I'm going to go ahead and do that for all of my cells. So notice that it automatically rounds for you. Okay, something like this. Now, for years, maybe I want to add, 3 sig figs in general. Maybe I want to report 3 sig figs in general. And so I'm going to go ahead and highlight this box, and you can also increase all of it at the same time. So in the previous example, I highlighted each cell and changed each sig figs, but I could have just highlighted the whole thing and did it in one go. Now, there might be some situations where if you highlight the whole thing and when you click on increase or decrease decimal, it'll do something weird. And so if it does something weird, then you guys are just going to have to do it manually, cell by cell. But it looks like I lucked out. I can go ahead and increase and decrease all of this at the same time. Okay. And so notice that I want to report 3 sig figs for my years. Here for 1.00, 2.00, 3.00, these are all 3 sig figs. But this cell only has 2 sig figs, that's 5 and 0. So this is a situation where I actually have to click on the individual cell and increase the number of decimal places manually. Okay. So now that I have my data table, I can go ahead and highlight this, and I can go ahead and copy this table. And I want to show you guys why, creating your text boxes and all of that stuff is important. So in the future, if you guys have to do this for a different class, once you guys create your table, you can go ahead and copy that. Right now, my Word is taking some time to load. Okay, give me a second here. All right. And I can go ahead and paste my data cell as a PDF, a picture, a TIFF. So I'll do a PDF. If that option pops up, it'll just give me a higher resolution. So notice that when I type it in, or when I paste it, I get something that looks like this. If I click out, you guys can see the borders. It kind of grayed out over here. But let's see if we can change that. So I can go ahead and resize everything in one go as a PDF file. So let's go ahead and see what it looks like as a PNG file. So as a PNG file, you'll notice that the resolution is not as clear as a PDF file. And so this is just a compare and contrast. So notice how it's more sharp around each border and each number. For the PNG file, it's kind of grainy. So that's really the only difference between a PDF and PNG. Okay. All right. So this is, again, just tools that you guys need to learn when utilizing Excel. Okay. All right. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to graph this. I want to see the trend of how the height of a human changes over a 3-year period. And so when you guys are typing in your data cells, one other thing that I need to mention is that you should not add in any words to your number. So please don't type in years. Do not do this. When you guys graph it with words right next to a number, you guys will get weird graphs. So please make sure that you guys keep numbers as numbers when you guys are converting your table into a graph. So to graph this, I'm going to click and highlight only the numbers. So I'm going to click and highlight only the numbers, and I'm going to click on Insert. And so here, top left corner, Insert right next to the home page. I'm going to hover my cursor right around the middle, and it's going to read XY scatter. Now, depending on the version of Excel that you have, you might see this function be laid out elsewhere. So you're just going to have to kind of find it. Each version of Excel, whether it's PC or Mac, is slightly different, not in terms of like the actual function, but the layout. They just haven't really streamlined it. So there's a whole bunch of options. When you're doing this for chemistry, you always want to choose the scatter with no lines, just the first option. Okay. And so when I click on that, I get a inset that looks like this. So I can go ahead and expand my graphs. And right now, if I click on the white space, so do you see how my cursor has the 4 arrows? I can click on the white space, not this guy. So if you click on the white space in the grid, it's just going to move your grid. So what you want to do to move your graph is click on the white space outside of your graph grid. And I can go ahead and move it to the right. So that way I'm not covering up my data. So there's a lot of things that I need to adjust. First, I need to increase the font size. So here I'm going to right click. I clicked on the actual number. So you can right click on any actual number. So notice how my cursor changes from the 4 arrows to a single arrow. I'm going to right click and I'm going to click on font. And I'm going to change that font size to some number that's legible to read. So let's just do 16, and that's what it looks like. I can go ahead and do the same thing here. So right click on an actual number on the x-axis, click on the font, and then I'll go ahead and replicate it as well. So 16. Okay. Next, what I want to do is I want to title my chart. So when you guys are creating your titles, you want to describe what this graph is communicating to the reader. And so what this graph is describing is the change, or well, let's just put in the growth of a human over time, over a period of time. And so I'm going to highlight my text because it's really small. And again, I can go ahead and right click on the text, change my font size to something large, so that way we can see it. Okay. All right. And so notice how the y-axis is not labeled, the x-axis is not labeled. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll to the left-hand corner where it says add chart element. And I think you might be able to, so PC users have this option where it says there's going to be a plus icon. Mac users doesn't have that icon. So PC users, you'll have the plus icon, and you might have some shortcuts underneath the plus icon, which is found on the top right corner. But for Mac users, looks like we don't have it. So let's go ahead and add chart element. So what we want to add is the axis titles. We have primary, horizontal, and then this little thing pops up. And I'm going to go ahead and highlight this and type in time. Make sure that you guys are including your units. So again, a number is meaningless without the units. It's pretty small, so I highlighted this. And then I'm going to right click font. And I'll change the font size to some ridiculous, font size just so I can easily see it. And then I'm going to do the same for the y-axis. So click on the add chart element, add axis titles, and then click on primary vertical. Again, I'm going to highlight that text, and then I'm going to type in height of a human, and then in parentheses, I'm going to put in feet. So basically, I'm just copying my descriptor from the table into my y-axis. Again, I'm going to highlight this whole thing and right-click, change the font size to some very large value. And when I click out, your graphs will kind of reorganize itself. Okay, so we have the growth of the human, we have our title, we have the title for the y-axis, we have the title for the x-axis. So one of the last things, and if you guys want, you can also change, I wonder if you can change the height or the size of the dots. I think you can. Let's select data. Does that give us anything? No? Okay. Anyways, I'm not going to get into it. So the, let's see here. One of the last things that you guys really need to learn how to do is to create a trend line. And so let's go ahead and click on one of the points. It doesn't matter what point you click on. You're going to right click, and then you're going to add trend line right here. Okay. So when you add the trend line, let me scroll my graph to the left. Notice how the data points do not align with the actual trend line. So all the trend line does is it gives you a linear relationship as to how the graphs kind of point. So since this trend line is pointing upwards, this is a positive slope trend line. If you have a trend line that's going downwards, then it's telling you that the trend is, going down, it's decreasing. Here, it's increasing. And that makes sense, over a period of time, the height of a human should increase, not decrease. And so while you guys click on this trend line, on the right-hand side, you'll see some options, and you might have to scroll down. But here you have two very important functions that you guys have to click. Display equation on the chart, and then display the R squared. And so when you guys click that, you see this little equation here. I'm gonna highlight this, and I'm gonna change the font size to something that is readable. And so I'm going to move the equation of the line, so and the R squared over to the left-hand side. So this equation of the line, oops. So this equation of the line represents the equation of the trend line, where the 1.0814 is going to represent the slope, and then the 2.3302 is going to represent the y-intercept. So if we were to take this trend line and extrapolate it back to the y-axis, it should hit 2.3302. Now, the last thing that's on this text box is the R squared. So the R squared is a statistical measure for how well the data points lie on the actual trend line. And the highest value is 1. So if you get a value of 1, that means all of the data points are exactly on that trend line, and therefore you have a high precision between the trend line and the data points. And so the R squareds will also mean other things in future chemistry labs. But for now, all you're concerned about is that the R squared describes the linearity of the data points with respect to the trend line. Again, the highest value of R squared is 1, and it only decreases from there. So notice that my data points are not exactly on the trend line. Thus, our R squared is less than 1. Okay. And so the last thing that I want to discuss is the sig figs of only the actual equation of the line. Don't change the sig figs for the R squared. Hopefully you guys have this ability. If you guys want to change your sig figs, all you have to do is just, you can do it manually. If I want to report 3 sig figs, I'm going to report 1.08. Since the next number is 1, that means it's going to be rounded down. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this. And there's my 3 sig figs. I can do the same thing for my y-intercept. Okay. And so this is just a quick crash course on how to work Excel. Here I have my data table. Here I have my my graph that has all the fixings that's required. And again, we can go ahead and right click, copy this. We can go ahead and paste it on Word. So let's go ahead and paste special. Again, the PDF just gives you a higher resolution. The TIFF file, same information, but it's just lower resolution. And so we can go ahead and take this and shorten it up. We can take this and expand it. And so it looks very pretty on your lab reports or for chemistry class or a future science class that you guys will take. All right. So that's pretty much it for me. I hope you guys learned something cool, something new from this tutorial video. I'll see you guys in lab. Have a good one.